Welcome, everybody. I would also like to acknowledge the ancestors and elders past and present, and acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's been an absolute delight working with Teen and Jess and others with the Restoration Decade Alliance, and specifically the Targets Working Group. And I guess it's a bit of an indicator when you go asking naive questions where you might end up. So looking at where are our targets for restoration has led us, one of those questions has led us here today. It's wonderful to be with you all. My role is to facilitate the workshop, keep the conversation rolling. As Teen mentioned, this is the first of three, a series of 3 workshops. This first workshop really is around exploring our perspectives and the different perspectives we bring to the conversation. The participant list is diverse. We've got people from all over the country and different backgrounds, which is just so valuable. We're going to have a discussion about what direction do we want to move in terms of restoration. And I guess really it's how do we all work together? The challenge ahead of us is so much bigger than any one organisation or any one of us alone. The second workshop planned will dive a little bit more deeply into, the task of setting indicators and targets, and I guess really having a go. And it's this journey starting where we are at and uncovering the considerations we need to take, but doing this and having this conversation together. The third workshop will really bring it all together. And you will have seen on your invitation or your RSVP that we've asked for people to choose a thematic group. Do you identify or want to focus on a marine aquatic thematic, or a terrestrial ecosystem thematic, or a social, community, cultural thematic? So the first 2 workshops will use those themes. The third, we will dissolve and bring everybody back together for a holistic conversation, and how might what we've learned move us towards a national ecosystem restoration plan. So today we've got 3 hours of jam-packed agenda. The first hour will really set the context, and we've got some amazing speakers for this first hour of the workshop. The second hour will really look at using the breakout groups and exploring our values and our goals and objectives. The third hour, we will reflect on what we've learnt so far and ask what principles and models and frameworks should we be looking at, and really drawing on the expertise of the participants here today. We've got Jess Garcia, who's co-facilitating and keeping an eye on technological things in the background. So if something goes awry for you during the workshop or Zoom plays up, just send Jess a message. You've got her email, facilitator@Restoration Decade Alliance, but also you can freely use the chat. So if questions or thoughts come up for you, please do use the chat. We don't have time for question and answers with the speaker series, but we will take those questions forward and we can explore them in the breakout rooms. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our speakers for the first hour of this workshop. And we've got Associate Professor Patrick O'Connor from the University of Adelaide speaking to the need for a framework for a national ecosystem restoration plan, and filling us in, I guess, a bit on the conversation so far since the Restoration Decade Alliance was founded. Professor Brendan Mackey from Griffith University will set the context for us in terms of the international conversation and the national conversation, and how they are linked and the work we might need to do there. Rachael Cavanagh is joining us. Rachael's a First Nations advisor and consultant, bringing a First Nations perspective to this conversation, which will be so valuable for our thinking moving forward. And we've got Sam Good, Director of Biodiversity Policy, and Belinda Jago, Principal Director of the Oceans Office from the federal government, to set the context for us and where the government's thinking and policy is at with the Global Biodiversity Framework and Target 2 the ecosystem restoration target. And then Simon Ferrier from CSIRO, Land and Water, to really bring our thinking back to the goal, or the task, I should say, at hand of how do we grapple with this process of setting goals and objectives and targets and indicators for ecosystem restoration in Australia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome all speakers and thank them for their contributions today, and hand over to Patrick O'Connor to kick us off. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Kirsten. Can you stop sharing and then I can, I think? Thanks. How's that for volume? Can you hear? Can you hear and see?
A bit louder wouldn't hurt.
Have I muted myself? Okay, how's that? Okay, my part's fairly easy. Essentially, all I want to do is just explain a little bit about how we ended up here. So obviously, there's international agreements, and Australia is now a party to some international agreements, and we'll hear about that later. But essentially, there was sort of a group of organisations that act essentially as advocates, coordinators and capacity in the restoration supply chain, if you like. So they are players who do restoration or advocate for or provide intelligence to, or provide coordination and capacity and information, extension to individuals who want to take action for restoration. And unlike many other developed industries, there isn't a clear industry body for restoration. So if it's a major task for the country, it didn't have an organisation that represented all parties, that had the legitimacy and imprimatur required to set an agenda for restoration, from the community sector and representing those who would take action. And as you see from the slide here about the continuum of restoration, there are drivers for restoration that come all the way back from the way that we even think about how we manage land, and so they start at the societal impacts, and restoration is a never-ending task. It is a continuous management challenge to maintain the kinds of function, values, and diversity that we seek in our landscapes. And so we need to be aware of the restoration requirement, and we need to see where we fit in the ecosystem of providers. And to do that, we want to shape ourselves into an arrangement where we're able to bring the best of everybody's capabilities, acknowledge the wide set of skills and capacity required, and play our roles at different levels. And one of the first places we start there is that we have to come to a shared agreement, a shared understanding of the what, when, how, where, who, which, and why of restoration. And so we need dialogue about that, and we then need to be able to document what we mean by where we are and where we're going, and to aid action for restoration, planning for restoration, the supply chain of the capacity, tools and resources required for restoration, towards a focused set of goals. And that goes right across this continuum of restoration activities. So in 2021, a group of initially 14 not-for-profit organisations came together to recognise that to boost the activity and success of the restoration decade internationally, Australia needed an alliance for restoration intent, including the organisations. And to do that, we needed to be able to reinforce and clarify our common purpose to conserve and restore ecosystems. And that is probably the first one there, is where we end up with a desire to produce a a direction-setting document and a direction-setting focus for the restoration that we would seek to move forward under international agreements. Because our partners in the Restoration Decade Alliance are spread at different thicknesses across different parts of the country. They tackle different challenges. They are sometimes conjoined with protection mechanisms, such as land protection, conservation under covenant, conservation under joint arrangements with Indigenous people. But there's also the action for restoration. So to focus that effort, we need to be able to reinforce and clarify our common purpose. We then need to be able to enlist the enormous capacity available for restoration, which occurs at all spatial levels and across all the sectors that are required for restoration. But we need to be able to use awareness raising to bring people towards that focal opportunity for restoration action and engagement. And so we needed a vehicle to do that, and the Restoration Decade Alliance is a vehicle for that carriage, and our planning processes will seek to create information that others can share and build on and learn from. And to do that, we want to also be able to promote best practice from the beginning, drawing on knowledge of different types and the work of the Alliance members, and to create a single voice for effectively communicating the joint aspirations. And so the workshops leading towards that focal point, the documentation of intent, and the interpretation of national and international commitments needs our help to focus that towards tangible, achievable things, smart targets where we can, and from those to be able to undertake advocacy and encouragement for action to be focused towards the outcomes that we're able to articulate. So the Restoration Decade Alliance set these points out in a document called the Darwin Agreement in May in 2021, and the processes that we're starting with these workshops is bringing together that focus from the discussions that alliance has had over the period of organising itself into a useful tool to achieve those 5 points. That's all I really wanted to say for this afternoon. But just to keep in mind that a plan, there are two ways to plan, and in natural resource management we see a bit of a split in the way that we plan. One plan is to say, what do we have to have, and plan for that, and then go and seek resources. The other way is to say, what resources do we have, and plan to the resources. The challenge when we have a decadal opportunity is to plan for the outcome we need and then go and raise the resources. And the Restoration Decade Alliance can set a high vision for that because its organisations are already deeply embedded in communities across the country, draw together enormous amounts of essentially restoration supply chain capability, and so it can be bold in the way that it sets its agenda, and so it should be bold. And so I think a plan that tackles the big problem and doesn't get hampered by how much resource do we have to allocate today or tomorrow will be a better plan than one that seeks to constrain itself by probably a difficult to share notion of what is possible. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for kicking us off and giving us some insight into the conversation so far. I would like to introduce our next speaker, who will be Rachael Cavanagh, speaking to First Nations perspectives. We're hoping Brendan Mackey's running a little late and hopefully will be able to join us shortly. Rachael, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really wonderful to have you on board. I'm just going to make sure there are so many people. It's wonderful. I'm going to replace my pin, which I hope means I can bring Rachael to the top of the speaker list for everybody, or the participant list for everyone. Thanks so much, Rachael, for joining us and bringing a First Nations perspective to this conversation. It's so important. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Kristen. So, Jingala Walo Walo, Nanya Nyaya Bolomang, Nanya Minyabul Wajang. So hello everyone, I'm Rachael Cavanagh. I'm a Minyabul woman from the far north coast of New South Wales, and just want to acknowledge the lands on which we're all meeting today, and for me that's Gumbaynggirr country on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. So obviously I'm coming to this discussion from a very different sort of perspective, but I think in saying that, it's a really important discussion, regardless of sort of what background or expertise that we're coming from, to come together and to have a discussion and look at the collaboration and which way we can move forward together. I think it's really important to understand globally that Indigenous people are leading the revitalisation or rekindling land management practices, regardless of sort of what expertise that they sort of fit in. And that comes down to the very real connection that First Nations people have with country. And so when I talk about country, I'm talking about the holistic approach to country. So that is our land, our water, our seas, and everything in between, including our languages and our practice. And in saying that, I think what's really exciting to see is that the need and the genuine drive to have that collaboration approach and have First Nations people a part of the conversation is happening across the field. So thank you for inviting me into this space to have those discussions. I think I suppose the best way to go and just sort of speak about restoration or how we care for country, like I mentioned before, it is a holistic approach, and we look at the very many complex layers of country or the environment or ecosystem in which is needed for that system itself to survive and thrive into the future. It's unfortunate that restoration hasn't had as much of an impact as, say, the biodiversity and other things that people are pushing for, but it is part of that bigger discussion and that bigger approach. When it comes to restoration and First Nations people, it's really based around our connection to country and that place, and it is really important to have First Nations partnerships, collaboration, and even Indigenous-led or First Nations-led approaches to how we move forward in managing country for the sustainability, I suppose, for into the future. When we look at country, when we manage country, we look at what we can do to benefit the next 7 generations. So we're not talking about now. Everything that we talk about is for the 7 generations in the future to come, and everything that we do today needs to benefit 7 generations. So that's how we sort of look at our cycle of being. And in that, I think things are starting to change around, you know, what that looks like and how do we partner with First Nations people to support them in leading this space, but how do we collectively and collaboratively work together to achieve the same outcomes? As a First Nations, you know, caring for country framework, it's hard to separate, you know, to separate the environment or the ecosystems into smaller different things. And what we might find as First Nations people, we may have things that are more specific and have more significance, whether it's tangible or intangible for us in that particular country, that may be different to a threatened species or to the conservation aspect or what that looks like. So how can we bring together both the knowledges that we have to have a better plan and a better framework moving forward? And, you know, as I mentioned before, we've got a very complex system or layered systems approach that we use when we're out looking after country and putting those prescriptions or management plans in place. And that comes down to, you know, our continuous connection to our country and our culture that has been here since millennia. And unfortunately, not having the right access to land as such to be able to continue our practice, but also the many barriers that we find when we are trying to access country, I think can be difficult at times, and the constraints around the policies and the frameworks that First Nations people have to fit into to even access the country can be quite difficult as such. So trying to break down and support the different systems and the different frameworks in which we as First Nations people work in, but then also non-Indigenous people work in, to find that approach where we can use First Nations knowledges that have been here since forever, but also Western sciences that can support those Indigenous-led leadership approaches when it comes to restoration or caring for country as that. You know, as we speak now, there's over 54% of the landmass in Australia has Indigenous rights, recognised Indigenous rights and management across the entire lands of Australia. And I think the exciting thing for me to hear about that is it was only 2016 that we only had 20% recognised Indigenous rights across the whole landmass of Australia. So that's a huge jump from 2016 till now. And what we know within that is the land that's managed by First Nations people, not only here in Australia, but globally, has the highest biodiversity than any other land managed by any other people. So I think working together and collectively, you know, we can start looking at, well, what do these targets and outcomes look like for not only Indigenous involvement and leadership in that space, but collectively and together, and how we can look at changing that, you know, you know, the story that we're hearing now, and really making I think successful and achievable outcomes in this space, I think, is really important. I also just want to highlight that, you know, First Nations people across Australia are definitely leaning more and more into wanting their own investment into the programs that they are delivering in their own communities and across the nation, and that their capacity within their communities and nationally is quite limited because of the work that they are doing. So you know, one of the things that I would like to say is that is how can these workshops that we're doing and the outcomes and the targets that we'll talk about, is how does that support, you know, First Nations people moving forward in this space, and how can we support the work that's on the ground and that's already happening, so that more and more First Nations people are out on country looking after country, and how can we support the, you know, that cross-cultural knowledge transfer so that everybody is on the same page and walking forward and together collectively, rather than segregating it all out, or this is us and that is them. We as First Nations people are wanting that. We're wanting to show how we know our country, we know the systems, and although there's been a lot of impacts over many years through mismanagement of country due to a number of different things, we want to showcase what we do. We want to showcase how we look after country and how we manage that, so that everybody can understand and see that what we're doing is for everybody. And I think, you know, that's where I can bring in my expertise and understanding of these broader, you know, approaches and frameworks to how we can manage, you know, and look after country together but then also highlighting the work that is happening on the ground, whether it's locally, you know, statewide or national. We are seeing First Nations people collaborating with other First Nations people internationally around climate change, adaptation, responses and solutions, because it is when I say climate change, it's because it's that holistic approach to country. So it's affecting every aspect of First Nations people. So mob are coming together to work with each other, mob, to understand the changes that are happening on country and use traditional knowledge and science backed by the many years of looking after country to move forward in this process. And how does that work together and collectively? So that is happening. And in that bigger space, it is about having the confidence in that as Indigenous led, but then, you know, sharing that, you know, across all of our communities, whether it's First Nations or not. So, yeah, I mean, I could keep going on, Kristen, and I know that on the thing it only had 5 minutes. So I'm not sure if I've spoken for longer than that so far. Or if, you know, you want somebody else to come through, but you know, just to sort of wrap it all up, it really is understanding the deep relationship that First Nations people have to country, and our practices when it does come to what is best for the environment and for country. Because for us, we are part of the system, we are a part of, you know, the environment, we're not separate to that. So, you know, something that my grandfather always says to us is, if you look after country, you're looking after your people. So it does have the social, cultural benefits of, you know, everything else. So it isn't separate. And when country is healthy, that we are healthy as people. So I will wrap it up there so I don't keep going on.
Thank you so much, Rachael. And you had 10 minutes, so it's perfect timing. Thank you very much. Your perspectives are just, it's so important to have this conversation right now. And I really like that framing around getting us to think about, you know, how we can support First Nations in this space alongside the conversation we're having around ecosystems. So thank you. And we look forward to working in some working groups later on, exploring some of this a bit more deeply. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. And now I would like to welcome, I can see that Sam Good has joined us. Hi, Sam. And we've got Belinda as well from the federal government. And it'd be great to get a bit of an update from Sam. Sam works in the biodiversity space and Belinda more in the ocean space. So getting their thoughts on this conversation and helping to set that context for us this morning. I'm going to see if I can pin both of you and remember, here we go, Belinda, and welcome and thank you both for joining us to set the context from a government perspective.
I think Belinda's just having some trouble with her camera, but she's online, so hopefully we'll be able to speak when it might take us off. So yeah, thanks so much for having us both at this meeting. I'm really so lucky here for the whole of the workshops that dipped into now. Sounds like a really rich discussion. So looking forward to taking a look at the recording. I am at this meeting, stepping out of a meeting I was just in, and we'll go back to with state and territory colleagues from what we call our biodiversity working group. So it's an officials level group that looks after the development and implementation of Australia's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So it has been topical. So I think I just want to give a little bit of context from the Commonwealth Government point of view. I'm sure this group is kind of across the context, so I don't need to step through all of the why we're here. But very briefly, just to skip through a few of the kind of milestones. So we had these targets set in December, the global targets. And the restoration target was more ambitious than we were expecting. Earlier drafts sort of had a 20% figure. There was a sort of push for the use of some absolute figures instead of a percentage. And then it wasn't really until the President's text of the framework dropped at the 11th hour that this 30% figure sort of arrived. Next big kind of milestones for us will be, now that we have the framework agreed, is that we need to be updating our NBSAP, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, by COP16. That's likely to be around October next year. And consistent with guidance adopted at COP15, that updated plan needs to include national targets outlining our planned contributions to the global targets. So we'll need to be setting national targets for each of the global targets, including the restoration target. They are national targets, and they will have to be agreed with states and territories. So that's what we're kind of discussing in the other meeting I've just stepped out of. We'll then need to report on the implementation of our NBSAP in February 2026, which is not that far away really, and then again in the middle of 2029. So I guess a part of the context to give is that for this restoration target, there's some points of difference with some of the other targets. So for example, other global targets already have clear analogues that have been set domestically in Australia. So we have a national zero extinctions target. We have a national target for 30 by 30 for protected and conserved areas. Whereas for target 2, that's not our starting point. There's lots of sort of great restoration work that's happening, but it's not rallied behind a national target in the way some other work streams are. So there's clear kind of opportunity for us there to set a bit more direction and coordinate some of those existing streams of work. We are at fairly early stages in our thinking on how to approach this target. So I'll kind of share what I can, but you do need to just add that kind of caveat. And it also means, you know, we're particularly interested in kind of hearing views from people on this call about how we should be approaching it, so that we can get the benefit of all the experience and thinking that you have all been doing. So some of the kind of issues that we're thinking through, clearly the definitional ones. So how to define degraded and effective restoration, so as to work out what our denominator and the other one is in our percentage. We may get some guidance from the CBD on some of those terms, but that will just be something that the Secretariat has cooked up. It won't sort of be something that's been negotiated and agreed by parties, and we're not sure when that will come, so we're not kind of holding our breath for that. We're thinking about the kind of range of activities and programs across all levels of government and outside of government that might contribute to the implementation of the target. Data is going to be another real challenge for us. We have sort of patchy and inconsistent data collection, so how to kind of meet those challenges and how to really measure our implementation outcomes. Some of the targets adopted in December have agreed global headline indicators that are sort of ready to go that everyone will be using to report on, but this is not one of those. We have agreement that we should be reporting on area under restoration, but with an asterisk that basically says what this means is still to be determined, and will be involved in intersessional work in the lead up to COP16 at the international level to work out what that means. But at the national level, we'll need to decide for ourselves before then how we're going to measure what we're doing. So on things like definitions, we will be looking at some of the things that were referenced in the conversation starter associated with this workshop, like the national standards for ecological restoration. And just to give you an idea about some of the activities that are sort of on our radar as being relevant to this target, we're thinking through the restoration activities that are both active and passive that take place within protected and conserved areas. We obviously have the National Land Care Program, which is highly relevant. It's a whole range of activities happening within the Murray-Darling Basin that we'll want to think through. We need to think through intersection with schemes like carbon credits or the nature repair market that's being established. Efforts to control invasive alien species will be relieving pressures on ecosystems and could be counted towards restoration. We're aware of all of the or at least some of the activities outside of government that can be relevant, the Bush Heritage Program, Greening Australia, etc. And then in the marine space, which I won't touch on too much, my colleague Belinda will get a bit more into, there's plenty happening in the reef, there's plenty happening around blue carbon, so we want to think through the relevance of those initiatives as well. So yeah, very much looking forward to hearing about the outcomes of this and the remaining workshops. And I just also wanted to flag that there'll be opportunities to contribute views and have input into our thinking here. So we will be attending and participating in the workshop that SEA UCN are putting on later in the year. We're planning to have our own consultation workshops around the country, probably around August, and then likely having some public consultation towards the end of the year also. That's the kind of rough map we have in our heads of some of the big set pieces, but of course we'll be talking to relevant stakeholders throughout as well. So that's it for me.
Great.
Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks so much for including me in this discussion as well. Restoration in the marine environment really is the sort of angle I'm coming from and interested in, but it's also, I wanted to just mention about the Sustainable Ocean Plan. So the Australian government has committed to, through being a member of the high-level panel on a sustainable ocean economy, to develop a national sustainable ocean plan. One of the pieces of such a plan really is to understand across our jurisdictions and across all the types of use and including restoration, for example, how it kind of comes together now, but also where we want to be in the future. So what are the big pieces that have to move in order for us to transition to a sustainable ocean economy that's growing, but also make sure that a healthy ocean is at its heart. Restoration is a really key piece of that. And so trying to understand what are those enablers that really, can support this kind of work or challenge it, frankly, is really useful for us to be aware of and be able to explore with relevant people, whether it's, relevant stakeholders, etc. So I'm coming from probably not quite I'm fascinated in the target, and I'll be listening very much this afternoon and into various other discussions, no doubt, over the next year. But definitely also listening from the perspective of where can we see those opportunities for restoration and what kind of things are coming up for you in that activity, in order to then be able to perhaps have a further conversation specifically around what that opportunity of the Sustainable Ocean Plan really presents for understanding the role of restoration in the marine environment and where we might need to take it. As Sam mentioned, there are, some big programs operating in restoration in the marine environment, including the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program that is predominantly focused on the, understandably on the Great Barrier Reef, but has applicability to other coral reef environments in Australia and globally as well. And the blue carbon ecosystem restoration work as well. So there's sort of two pieces that we are definitely tracking and understanding and so forth, and seeing how they can contribute in different ways. But am definitely interested in the broader conversation to understand sort of where we can help perhaps amplify something that comes out, or where you're heading, in order to then be able to feed it into something like the national plan. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Belinda, and thanks for bringing the watery ocean perspective. And there is a theme, it is tricky, this coming at it from a holistic perspective and then looking at it through themes. And there is a breakout theme dedicated to the aquatic, marine and all things rivers. So appreciate that update from both you and Sam this afternoon, and look forward to continuing the conversation and getting a bit of a perspective on the timeline through to August and just how timely this conversation and workshop is. Thanks again. Now, before I'm just going to remove this pen, look at this lovely group of people. I am so happy to be able to introduce to you all, and I'm sure many of you already know Professor Brendan Mackey from Griffith University. Hi, Brendan. Great to have you with us this afternoon, and apologies for that link mix-up. But I think it's actually really great segue from that conversation, an update from Sam and Belinda to you to bring us to, I guess, the international perspective around this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. So I've got a PowerPoint, brief PowerPoint to share, and I'll just
I think we've given PowerPoint power to everybody, so you should be good.
Yeah. Let's see what happened when I press the button. At the moment, I've just got 2 black screens. So there we go. So
There it is.
everyone see that? So yeah. So I was asked to say something really about the international context, and what that implies for our national context. And I really wanted to focus on the new global biodiversity framework, because we all know there's this target 2, but actually a careful reading of the framework reveals restoration is actually highlighted or implied in many parts of the framework and in many parts of the commitments. So I think it's really useful to kind of just go through that in some detail, because we do have a Commonwealth government now that's very committed to the new framework, and a minister that is committed to having a very ambitious and progressive biodiversity conservation agenda that helps give effect to those international commitments. So I think I did want to just spend the time I have to go through that, and then end with saying a few more targeted things about Australia. And so as I think everyone would know, the Global Biodiversity Framework was the post-IACHI target, post-2020 framework. So, and it was a decision adopted at the last conference of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's got a number of components. I mean, and I'm just going to go through some of the highlighted things. But the Section A background, right up front, it says nature can be conserved, restored and used sustainably by other global society goals are simultaneously met through urgent and concerted efforts fostering transformative change. So right at the top of the document, restoration is highlighted. And the other point here that I've highlighted is that the framework is action and results orientated, and it's designed to guide and promote implementation the revision, development, updating and implementation of policies, goals, targets and national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And that is something the government has said it's going to do. It is going to revise its national biodiversity strategies and action plans to help give effect to its commitments here. So this is very important context, I think, for us. Section C has what it's called considerations for the implementation. And again, I think these are very relevant for our work here. Again, right up front, it says the framework acknowledges the important roles and contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities as custodians of biodiversity and as partners in its conservation, restoration and sustainable use. So again, restoration keeps being highlighted as a necessary action along with conservation and protection and sustainable use. So previously we kind of talked about conservation and sustainable use. So it's interesting that restoration has been injected, if you like, installed into the middle of that now. And the other thing I think is relevant, that this is a framework for the whole of government and whole of society, and relies on action and cooperation by all actors of society. And I think this is critical for the ecological restoration in Australia, which is so heavily dependent upon volunteerism and NGO organisations and related networks. And the point L there is that the implementation of the framework should be based on scientific evidence and traditional knowledge and practice. So traditional knowledge and practice-based knowledge, as well as our conventional, as well as scientific evidence. So again, this to me speaks obviously to the role of our First Nations, traditional knowledge, but also the community of practices that we have in Australia when it comes to issues of restoration. And it also flags that the framework has to be implemented based on the ecosystem approach of the convention, which very much means we're talking about ecological restoration. So it clearly, to me, makes clear that the restoration we're talking about is ecologically based. Or under the convention, there's a definition of the ecosystem approach is defined in there's a 17-point explanation of what's meant by that in the convention. It then goes on to talk about the mission of the framework for the period up to 2030 towards the 2050 vision is, as it's written there, to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and to put nature on a path to recovery. So again, that clearly is talking about restoration and ecological restoration and an ecosystem-based approach right up as part of the mission. And then there are 4 long-term global goals, and 2 of them reference restoration. So goal A, the integrity, connectivity and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced or restored, substantially increasing the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. And goal B, biodiversity is sustainably used and managed, and nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem functions and services, are valued, maintained and enhanced, with those currently in decline being restored, supporting the achievement of sustainable development. So again, in 2 of the 4 global goals, restoration has been put to the centre stage, front and centre stage. Section H follows with 23 global targets for urgent action over the decade to 2030, i.e. now. And again, we all were very excited and encouraged to read about target 2, ensure that by 2030, at least 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial inland water and marine and coastal ecosystems are under effective restoration in order to enhance biodiversity and ecosystem function and services, ecological integrity and connectivity. So that, is a wonderful target which complements target 3, which is ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial inland water areas, etc., especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem function and services, are effectively conserved and managed through ecologically representative, and I've highlighted here, well-connected, protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures and are integrated into wilder landscapes. So I'm also suggesting that when we look at this issue of well-connectedness and effective other area-based conservation measures and how this is integrated into wider landscapes, I think there's a key role for restoration there as well in target 3. And restoration is also flagged and mentioned in target 4, which is about threatened species, urgent management actions to halt human-induced extinctions of known threatened species and for their recovery, as well as to maintain and restore the genetic diversity within and between populations. And again, target 6 is on invasive alien species, and I flagged they're eradicating or controlling invasive alien species, which is clearly a major activity within ecological restoration. So 2 of the 4 goals and 4 of the 23 targets, I would argue there's important role for restoration there. And also, interestingly, target 11 talks about restoring, maintaining and enhancing nature's contributions to people. So again, restoration is the first word there. And again, I'd just like to mention target 19, enhancing the role of collective action, including by Indigenous people and local communities, including community-based natural resource management, etc. So again, this just highlights the importance of the work being done by land care groups, NAILSMA, other connectivity conservation initiatives like the Great Eastern Ranges, Gondwana, etc. So just coming to our national setting, I think that the national policy, because the government has said that they are going to have national policy and related programs, that having adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework, they're committed to using it, to guiding Australia's coming decade of global action on biodiversity. The government has said its priorities is to revise and update its national biodiversity strategy and action plan. So clearly we would want that to happen in a way which highlighted ecological restoration. And another priority for the Australian government is, and our Environment Minister, our wonderful Environment Minister, is regional planning for spatial planning targets, including both protected area and restoration targets, because we've now got a 30% spatial restoration target that has to be planned for. The other environmental conservation measures are also being discussed in parallel with the restoration ones, and I just think there's a great opportunity to look at linkages between the OECMs, as they're being called, and the restoration targets. And obviously a priority for the government are our 580 listed fauna threatened species and the need to help restore and enhance their core habitat. There's also money for new IPAs and increased funding for current IPAs, and of course a lot of that, much of that involves ecological restoration work as well. So I think within the government's current priorities, there's plenty of scope for advancing restoration strategies and plans and actions. And finally, I'll just note that for me, when we're thinking about ecological restoration, a really important message to be conveying to everyone is how critical they are for addressing the biodiversity climate crises and for providing integrated biodiversity climate solutions. Because we need this kind of integrated biodiversity climate action for conservation, for ecosystem-based adaptation and carbon mitigation outcomes. You know, the worst that we can have is carbon offsets through monoculture tree plantings, right? There's negative biodiversity outcomes. It's actually high risk and unstable carbon stocks and doesn't provide any nature-based solutions regarding adaptation. So when we're thinking about restoration targets, I think we need to be, it'd be really helpful if we can think about the role that restoration can play in integrated biodiversity climate solutions. We can do that in various ways. I think thinking about how we can incorporate ecological connectivity into our restoration targets can be very helpful here. Of course, we need connectivity for dispersive fauna, our migratory birds. We need biological permeability in the landscapes, metapopulation dynamics to maintain ecological flows, to maintain wetlands and groundwater dependent ecosystems, for replenishing, buffering, connecting habitat for threatened species, and for enabling many of the natural responses to climate change that species are going to have, such as dispersing for a suitable bioclimate. And as I like to remind people, we do have an effective, cost-effective carbon and capture storage technology. It's called ecosystems. They remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in relatively stable, resilient and long-lived pools in the living and dead biomass soil carbon. So I just to conclude, restoration has a critical role to play in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and in helping develop and implement Australia's national biodiversity plans. And it's also got a critical role to play in providing integrated biodiversity climate solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. That really did help set the context for us and make those links between international and specifically the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you for going through all of those targets and highlighting the links to restoration for us. I think that's really critical as we lead into our conversation this afternoon Again, this is a recorded webinar, so we can look back over all of these presentations and think a bit more deeply as well. Our final speaker for the introductory context setting is Simon Ferrier. Thanks so much for joining us, Simon. Simon is going to take us on a bit of a deeper dive in terms of the task that we're approaching and beginning the conversation around this afternoon. So I will hand over to you, Simon, and
thanks, Kristen. You can see and hear me all right?
Can do.
Right, that's always a relief. And thanks very much to Brendan for giving us the guided tour of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It will make my job quite a bit easier. You will see I've changed the title that I was given slightly. By the end of this talk, you will understand that I'm a very strong proponent of the role that indicators play in processes such as this. You'll also see that I am no longer a member of CSIRO Environment. My terrestrial colleagues and I have not long ago joined our marine and atmospheric colleagues in CSIRO to form a new business unit called CSIRO Environment. Okay. I was asked to talk about the purpose of goals and targets. I'll probably only do that on this first slide. And the way I think about the purpose of goals and targets, there are probably three parts to this. You know, the first and most obvious use of goals and targets, particularly those set at global or even national level, is just to generate the impetus for action. So, you know, having ambitious goals and targets hopefully will motivate people to act and will motivate those who can contribute funding to allow that action to actually do that. So that's a very important role. But then I think there are two other roles that people talk about or think that goals and targets can play. But in this talk, I'll perhaps suggest that on their own, global and national goals and targets don't really do a good job of addressing these other two needs. And so those needs are figuring out how to prioritize actions at a local or landscape scale. So actually informing decisions about where and what you do in the landscape, and apologies for my terrestrial focus in this talk. And the third use is around monitoring progress towards those global goals and targets. Now, why am I suggesting that those two activities, the last two that I mentioned, you know, perhaps aren't well addressed by global and national goals and targets on their own? Well, to explain that, let's take a look at the Global Biodiversity Framework, and this is a diagram out of an expert input report prepared by a group of scientists under the auspices of Future Earth and GeoBon. I was a member of that group. This was prepared, I think almost a year before the Global Biodiversity Framework was actually adopted. So you'll see that, yep, some of the details of the various goals and targets have changed somewhat. But the main point of this diagram is to illustrate that, you know, all of these goals and targets under that framework, and Brendan did a great job of running through them, they're all interlinked. Yeah, they don't operate in isolation. And so something like Target 2 about restoring ecosystems is going to have the implementation of actions under that target is going to impact on a whole range of goals or different elements of goals in the GBF. And so straight away, that means that if you're prioritising what to do in the way of implementing restoration actions under Target 2, you need to have an eye to what the consequences of that restoration will be for the goals that are being we're trying to achieve under the GBF, or in other words, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And so we know, you know, and there have been a whole swag of papers, scientific journal papers that have come out over recent years that have shown over and over that how well meeting overall aerial targets or proportional targets for either protection or restoration, the extent to which that will actually achieve the outcomes that we want, for example, in relation to persistence of biodiversity, depends very much on where those actions are implemented, not just the total amount of action implemented or the total amount of ecosystems put in protected areas or restored. And so this is just one example of a global analysis of that sort. And so, as well as showing that it depends on where you do things, it also showed very clearly that it depends on what you are trying to achieve by where you do things. So where you might prioritise efforts for biodiversity in terms of restoration may well be quite different from the places that you might prioritise for climate change mitigation, for example. The other thing to remember about the GBF is that that restoration target, as Brendan so clearly outlined, is just one of a whole bunch of targets for which the actions under those targets are really going to work together, hopefully, to achieve the outcomes that are envisaged from the GBF. So we can't just think of restoration targets operating in isolation from things like protected area targets. It's going to be the net impact of those activities in combination, which is going to determine the final outcomes in relation to the various goals specified in the GBF. And so just to pull up another diagram from that expert input report that I mentioned, and this was just simply saying that to really properly integrate those various components of the GBF, and particularly to link the planning of actions under the various targets to the monitoring of outcomes under the goals, indicators have a really crucial role to play here. And we were particularly promoting the idea of what's often called in the economic world leading indicators, which are indicators that can guide decision making, in this case planning where and what to do in the way of restoration, indicators that assess those priorities in terms of what the expected outcomes might be in relation to the various goals in the GBF. So the whole idea is that by using the same indicators to guide actions in relation to the targets as the indicators that we use for monitoring outcomes, we can therefore link the planning of actions to the monitoring of outcomes, which is really crucial. Now, I just wanted to throw in here, and I was delighted to see that Jamie Kirkpatrick is on this call as one of the original pioneers of the principle of complementarity, which is, you know, it goes back decades now, but it's just as important today as it was back then. And we often overlook this, that doing any of this work for biodiversity is fundamentally more challenging than it is for carbon and for climate change. I mean, for carbon, if you can assess the carbon sequestration capacity of, you know, ecosystems at individual locations on the planet, then you can basically get what the overall sequestration capacity is of a larger region by just adding up those individual numbers. But biodiversity and biodiversity outcomes is something that's inherently non-additive. So in other words, what you do at any given location, the contribution that will make to the collective outcome at a whole system level depends very much on the actions at other locations. And so that, you know, there are various dimensions of that. There's complementarity in terms of biological composition, but there are also important interactions in terms of connectivity processes, which Brendan mentioned. But I want to sound here a really positive note, which is that, you know, thanks to a lot of work that's happened over recent years, certainly within CSIRO, but elsewhere around the world, we're now in a position where we have a whole new generation of integrative whole landscape indicators that can account for a lot of the complexities that I've just mentioned, and can put us in a position to really get serious about linking the prioritization and implementation of actions at a local or landscape level to the monitoring of outcomes at a larger system level, whether that be national or global. So the message I want to leave you with is basically that if we are going to get serious about linking actions and outcomes across scales, then if we're talking about developing goals and targets for restoration within Australia, then we need to very closely integrate that with the development of indicators that can play this critically important role. Okay, thank you very much.